I'm about to tell you how this tenant just lost a $12,000 cash for keys agreement. But first, my name's Daniel Hale. I'm a real estate agent in Ontario and I work with a ton of landlords, which means I'm constantly battling landlord and tenant issues, and I made this channel to help landlords navigate those situations a lot easier. Now, a couple of months ago, a landlord called me from this channel and asked me to sell their tenanted property. So before I put the property up for sale, I always like to go and meet the tenant and have a conversation with them to see how things are going to go. And the landlord gave me permission because we had the discussion before I arrived about offering the tenant a cash for keys settlement just to help the sale go a little bit smoother, in hopes that we could get our photos, she wouldn't give us any issues with showings, all of those things, and we could also offer it to an investor and give them vacant possession. Because when you're selling a tenanted property, if it is an investor, they must assume the tenancy, or you can do a cash for keys agreement and get that tenant to sign an N11 to move out. If it is somebody for personal use, you then can evict the tenant for personal use. But when you're selling a tenanted property, the goal is to sell it for top dollar, always. So if you have an agreement with the tenant beforehand, it's always nice because then you can sell that property to anybody that wants to buy it, whoever brings you the best price. Now, I approached the tenant, I spoke to them, and we actually offered them $10,000. That tenant said no, and she told me she wanted $20,000 and she wasn't going to settle for less. In this scenario, the landlords decided to up the cash for keys amount to $12,000, and the tenant still said no. Now let me explain to you. When you're doing a cash for keys agreement, you should never, ever let the tenant dictate how much that cash for keys amount is going to be. And by using these strategies, you'll be able to avoid that and make sure that the amount makes more sense for the landlord. So what I did was I let the tenant know this cash for keys agreement is only going to be on the table for a short period of time. The reason why you must do this, you want to give the tenant a date that the cash for keys amount that you're going to give them will expire if they don't agree. A lot of people will do a cash for keys agreement and they'll try to say to the tenant, we're gonna give you X amount of dollars, and they don't put any pressure on the tenant to accept. For example, the house isn't up for sale, and they don't give the tenant a date on when they need to accept. So that tenant says, well, I'm gonna kick my feet up. There's no pressure on me. I don't have to leave. I can stay here, and there's nothing you can do about it. But when you put the property up for sale or you give them a date, the tenant knows that past the date, that agreement becomes null and void and gets thrown in the garbage. And if the property's up for sale, which is what I told the tenant, we're going up for sale, and here's the scenario that could happen. I cannot keep this agreement on the table forever, because if somebody comes across and buys the property or brings us an offer for personal use, it wouldn't make sense to the landlord to give you any cash for keys at all, because they can give you an N12 notice of eviction, which is a notice of eviction to end the tenancy for the buyer's personal use. So the tenant still said no. Maybe she didn't believe me. Maybe she thought I was bluffing. Maybe she thought we were gonna cave and give her the $20,000. But I put this property up for sale and we ended up getting a lot of showings. And I knew that eventually the person will come along for personal use and buy this property. They always do. Sometimes it takes a little bit more time, but I promise you, if you're selling your tenanted property, somebody will always come along for personal use, and that tenant's walls will cave in if they're not cooperating. So if you're a tenant, you might as well cooperate and at least take some money or work on a cash for keys agreement because this tenant actually left with nothing. Now, before she left with nothing, we actually got an offer from an investor that wanted to flip the property. Now, in Ontario, you can't purchase a property, evict a tenant, and flip it. It's illegal. You have to move in for a period of up to 1 year. So again, I received this offer. I called the tenant. I said, look, we have an offer on the table. I'm gonna be honest with you. It's for somebody that is an investor. They want to renovate the property. They're not moving in. They're an investor. And again, she said $20,000 is my number or I am not leaving. So I told the investor, sorry, we cannot work with you. We had a lot of showings. I told the landlords not to worry because somebody's gonna come along for personal use. And what ended up happening, a buyer called. She wanted to move into the property. She saw the property, absolutely loved it, wanted to move in for personal use. So I ended up selling the property and we had to give the tenant an N12 notice of eviction for that buyer's personal use. Next thing you know, the tenant's calling me freaking out, asking me what happened with the cash for keys offer, why it's off the table. I told her that it was going to be off the table. We can't offer this for a long period of time. We tried to work with you. You said no. And believe it or not, the tenant ended up getting evicted for the buyer's personal use and walked away with 1 month's rent, which is the total compensation you're required to give in Ontario for an N12. So instead of taking the $12,000 that she was offered, my landlord ended up giving her 1 month's rent compensation. He sold the property for top dollar and the tenant got evicted. Now this has actually happened more than once. It happens often. And the reason why tenants are getting away with high cash for keys agreements is if the landlord or the landlord's real estate agent doesn't know how to navigate the situation. For example, they will sell the property firm and promise vacant possession on a specific date. And what happens is as you get closer to that date, the tenant says, I'm not leaving, and the seller starts freaking out because they're worried about the buyer suing them for not being able to provide vacant possession. You should never, ever, ever do this. And then what happens is the tenant says, okay, I'll leave, I want $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, something absolutely crazy, and the landlord ends up being forced to give it to them so that the buyer doesn't sue them and all this litigation and mess doesn't happen. So, when you're doing a cash for keys agreement, you want to make sure that if it's a sale of a property, you have the right to extend the agreement for the closing date. You also issue an N12 notice for the buyer's personal use. You issue the notice to the landlord and tenant board so you have a hearing date, and no matter what, the tenant's gonna end up having to move out. So if you do things right, you won't be stuck having to pay a crazy amount of money. So when you're doing the cash for keys agreement in Ontario, do not ever let the tenant dictate the amount that it's going to be. Give them a reasonable number that makes things easier for both of you guys and actually assists them with moving out and finding a new place. Make sure that you actually put some pressure on the tenant to accept that offer. Don't just offer them the money and tell them that this is gonna be there indefinitely no matter what, because then they're gonna take their sweet time making that decision. You wanna put an expiry date on it. If you're going up for sale, tell them that anytime this could be taken away, because I don't know if somebody's coming to buy this property for personal use or not. So please let me know as soon as possible. And if you don't, this could be taken off the table completely. If the tenant does come to a cash for keys agreement with you, it's always best to do it before you go on the market, because if they do, they'll do things like clean up the house for the showings, they'll allow you photos, they won't have any issues with the showings, they'll move out upon that specific date, everything will go really smooth, which helps you sell the property. But again, if that number's too high, don't do it, just put it up for sale and start applying that pressure and just wait for the right buyer. But I can't believe it. This tenant walked away from $12,000 and ended up getting nothing. If you're looking for more landlord advice, make sure you guys subscribe to this channel. And if you need any assistance with your tenanted properties, just shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call, and I'll see you guys in the next video.